I came home from that summit feeling like I was finally hitting my stride. 3 days out of state, surrounded by people who actually knew what they were doing, pitching ideas, shaking hands, getting real interest instead of polite nods. The kind of trip that leave you exhausted but wired at the same time, replaying conversations in your head and thinking, yeah, this is going somewhere. I remember driving back from the airport with the windows cracked, city lights blurring past, already planning how I'd tell Emily about the contacts I'd made and the feedback I'd gotten. I wasn't expecting a parade or anything, just something normal, familiar, grounding. A hug, maybe a joke about me being gone too long, her stealing my jacket because it smelled like my cologne. Instead, the apartment felt off the second I stepped inside. Too quiet, too clean, like someone had staged it. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, back straight, her phone face down in front of her like a prop. She didn't look up when I set my bag down. No smile, no relief, no annoyance. Just this neutral, practiced calm that made my stomach tighten before she even spoke. I started to say her name, started to tell her about the flight delay, but she cut me off with my full name, the way people do when they're about to be very serious. She told me we needed to talk, and gestured to the chair across from her. I sat down slowly, still wearing my jacket, still not fully understanding what was happening. Then she launched into it like she'd been waiting all day to press play. No raised voice, no tears, just measured sentences delivered with the confidence of someone reading from notes. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking while I was gone, that she'd come to the realization our relationship needed to be evaluated. Not worked on together, not discussed, evaluated, like a quarterly performance review. She told me I had 7 days. 7 days to prove I was worth staying with. She actually used those words, worth staying with, like I was a subscription she was debating canceling. She said it wasn't an ultimatum, then immediately explained exactly what would happen if I failed. She framed it as a gift, an opportunity, a structured chance for me to show growth. She called it a relationship evaluation period, and said it was something healthy couples did when one partner felt uncertain. What threw me most wasn't the threat, it was the expectation behind it. She paused after saying 7 days, watching me closely, clearly waiting for something. Panic probably. Questions about what she wanted, what the rules were, how I could make her happy. I could almost see the version of me she expected to get, the one who would lean forward, voice tight, asking for a checklist, and promising to do better. She even added that she wasn't going to spell out the criteria, because that would defeat the purpose. I was supposed to figure it out, to intuit what she needed, to chase clarity she was deliberately withholding. As she talked, I noticed how controlled she was. This wasn't emotional or impulsive. This was rehearsed. Her tone never wavered, and she never once asked how the trip went or how I felt standing there being judged. She mentioned my ambition in vague terms, said she supported my career, but questioned whether I was present enough, whether I brought enough value to her life as it stood value. That word stuck with me, echoing in my head while she explained timelines and expectations like she was doing me a favor by not ending things outright. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't argue or defend myself. I just listened, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like a quiet, unsettling clarity. The confidence I'd walked in with didn't disappear, it hardened. I realized she wasn't seeing the same future I was building in my head on that drive home. She wasn't standing beside me looking forward. She was standing above me, holding a stopwatch, waiting to see if I'd scramble fast enough to impress her. When she finally finished, she leaned back slightly, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me, clearly expecting a response that would confirm she had the upper hand. I sat there in silence for a few seconds, still wearing my jacket, still feeling the momentum of that summit buzzing under my skin, and understood that whatever happened next, the relationship I thought I had already didn't exist anymore. I came home from that summit feeling like I was finally hitting my stride. 3 days out of state, surrounded by people who actually knew what they were doing, pitching ideas, shaking hands, getting real interest instead of polite nods. The kind of trip that leaves you exhausted but wired at the same time, replaying conversations in your head and thinking, yeah, this is going somewhere. I remember driving back from the airport with the windows cracked, city lights blurring past, already planning how I'd tell Emily about the contacts I'd made and the feedback I'd gotten. I wasn't expecting a parade or anything, just something normal, familiar, grounding. A hug, maybe a joke about me being gone too long, her stealing my jacket because it smelled like my cologne. Instead, the apartment fell off the second I stepped inside. Too quiet, too clean, like someone had staged it. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, back straight, her phone face down in front of her like a prop. She didn't look up when I set my bag down. No smile, no relief, no annoyance. Just this neutral, practiced calm that made my stomach tighten before she even spoke. I started to say her name, started to tell her about the flight delay, but she cut me off with my full name, the way people do when they're about to be very serious. She told me we needed to talk, and gestured to the chair across from her. I sat down slowly, still wearing my jacket, still not fully understanding what was happening. Then she launched into it like she'd been waiting all day to press play. No raised voice, no tears, just measured sentences delivered with the confidence of someone reading from notes. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking while I was gone, that she'd come to the realization our relationship needed to be evaluated. Not worked on together, not discussed, evaluated, like a quarterly performance review. She told me I had 7 days. 7 days to prove I was worth staying with. She actually used those words, worth staying with, like I was a subscription she was debating canceling. She said it wasn't an ultimatum, then immediately explained exactly what would happen if I failed. She framed it as a gift, an opportunity, a structured chance for me to show growth. She called it a relationship evaluation period and said it was something healthy couples did when one partner felt uncertain. What threw me most wasn't the threat, it was the expectation behind it. She paused after saying 7 days, watching me closely, clearly waiting for something. Panic probably. Questions about what she wanted, what the rules were, how I could make her happy. I could almost see the version of me she expected to get. The one who would lean forward, voice tight, asking for a checklist, and promising to do better. She even added that she wasn't going to spell out the criteria, because that would defeat the purpose. I was supposed to figure it out, to intuit what she needed, to chase clarity she was deliberately withholding. As she talked, I noticed how controlled she was. This wasn't emotional or impulsive. This was rehearsed. Her tone never wavered, and she never once asked how the trip went or how I felt standing there being judged. She mentioned my ambition in vague terms, said she supported my career, but questioned whether I was present enough, whether I brought enough value to her life as it stood. Value. That word stuck with me, echoing in my head while she explained timelines and expectations like she was doing me a favor by not ending things outright. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't argue or defend myself. I just listened, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like a quiet, unsettling clarity. The confidence I'd walked in with didn't disappear, it hardened. I realized she wasn't seeing the same future I was building in my head on that drive home. She wasn't standing beside me looking forward. She was standing above me, holding a stopwatch, waiting to see if I'd scramble fast enough to impress her. When she finally finished, she leaned back slightly, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me, clearly expecting a response that would confirm she had the upper hand. I sat there in silence for a few seconds, still wearing my jacket, still feeling the momentum of that summit buzzing under my skin, and understood that whatever happened next, the relationship I thought I had already didn't exist anymore. The days after that conversation settled into something strangely calm on my end, even though I could feel the tension radiating from her side of the apartment. I didn't announce any change, didn't make a show of indifference. I just kept doing what I'd already been doing long before she decided to put a countdown on my existence. I woke up early, made my coffee, went to the gym before work, trained with the same focus I always had. I stuck to my schedule, ate clean, showed up to meetings on time, handled my responsibilities without rushing or over-explaining myself. There was no dramatic withdrawal, no cold shoulder, just consistency. That consistency seemed to irritate her more than any argument ever could. The first morning, she hovered near the door while I was tying my shoes, clearly expecting me to say something about the timeline she'd imposed, to ask for reassurance or instructions. When I didn't, she sighed loudly and reminded me that the 7 days were already counting down. I acknowledged it with a nod and left for the gym like I always did. I didn't do it to make a point. I genuinely didn't see a reason to disrupt my routine, to perform anxiety on demand. By the second day, the call started. Not emergencies, not anything concrete, just check-ins disguised as concern. Did you make it to work? Are you coming straight home? We should talk later. I answered when it made sense, and ignored them when I was busy, the same way I always handle my phone. I wasn't playing games. I wasn't trying to punish her. I just refused to drop everything every time she felt the need to feel important. That refusal clearly wasn't part of her plan. She had expected me to orbit around her decision, to rearrange my life, to revolve around proving myself. Instead, she watched me lift my gym bag over my shoulder and head out the door with the same calm expression I wore before the ultimatum existed. I could feel her eyes on me when I cooked my meals, when I worked late at my desk, when I went for evening walks to clear my head. There was a growing unease in the air, like she was waiting for a crack that never appeared. The messages became longer and more emotional as the days went on. Paragraphs about feeling disconnected, about how she thought this week would look different, about how my silence made her feel unimportant. I read them when I had time, responded briefly and honestly, never defensive, never pleading. I didn't rush to reassure her, because I wasn't uncertain about myself. I didn't over-explain, because I wasn't confused about my priorities. That steadiness, the lack of visible fear, seemed to unravel her. By midweek, the controlled tone she'd started with was gone. She oscillated between irritation and vulnerability, between passive-aggressive comments and sudden softness that felt less like affection and more like bait. She started bringing up memories, inside jokes, moments she knew had once mattered to me, clearly hoping something would pull me off balance. When that didn't work, frustration crept in her voice, sharper and less polished than before. I noticed her watching me more closely, reacting to what I didn't do rather than what I did. I wasn't begging for reassurance. I wasn't asking how I was doing on her invisible scorecard. I wasn't trying to earn back something that had been placed just out of reach on purpose. I was living my life the same way I had before she tried to make it conditional, and that exposed something she hadn't anticipated. The leverage only existed if I believed she held it. By the end of that stretch of days, the dynamic had shifted without a single dramatic confrontation. The distance between us wasn't created by anger or neglect, but by dignity. I wasn't pulling away. I simply wasn't shrinking, and the more stable I remained, the more she seemed to panic at the realization that the script she'd written required desperation to function. Once she realized her silence and distance strategy wasn't bending me, she pivoted hard. Almost overnight, the tension in the apartment was replaced with an aggressive kind of warmth that felt just as calculated as the ultimatum had been. She started cooking elaborate dinners again, the kind she used to make early in our relationship when everything was effortless and new. Candles on the table, music she knew I associated with good memories, her voice suddenly softer, lighter, like the previous days of control and pressure had never happened. I thanked her, ate the meals, cleaned up afterward, and went back to my routine without commenting on the shift. I didn't reward it with relief or suspicion. I simply observed. When the dinners didn't reset the dynamic, she escalated in public. She insisted we go out together, not because she wanted time with me, but because she wanted witnesses. Restaurants we were known at, places where staff recognized us as a couple, environments where her hand on my arm and her smile could be seen and validated. She leaned into me a little too much, laughed a little too loudly, kissed my cheek at moments that felt performative. I stayed polite and composed, never pulling away dramatically, never leaning in to reassure her either. I could feel the tension behind her gestures, the need for control hiding under the affection. Then came the guilt. She started talking about how confused she was, how this week had been so hard for her emotionally, how she felt like she was losing me even though she was the one who set the terms. She framed her stress as something I was responsible for alleviating, dropping comments about sleepless nights and anxiety in the same calm tone she'd once used to deliver the ultimatum. I listened without interrupting, acknowledged her feelings without accepting blame, and went back to what I was doing. That balance seemed to unsettle her more than outright disagreement. After that, other people appeared. Friends suddenly reached out, casually at first, checking in, then more directly suggesting I be patient. That relationships went through phases, that Emily was just scared of losing me. Family members asked how things were going with a tone that told me they'd already been briefed. I didn't argue with anyone or correct their assumptions. I kept my responses neutral, factual, and minimal. Each interaction added another layer to the pattern I was quietly tracking. The most revealing moments came when she stopped waiting for private settings. She showed up at my gym once, claiming she was in the area, watching me train with an intensity that had nothing to do with support. Another time she appeared near my office after work, pretending coincidence while positioning herself directly in my path. Each encounter was framed as concern or affection, but the timing and locations made the intent obvious. She wanted access, visibility, reassurance on her terms. Throughout all of it, I stayed calm and consistent. I didn't confront her, didn't accuse her, didn't escalate emotionally. I started documenting things, not out of paranoia, but clarity. Dates, times, shifts in behavior, who reached out and when. I saved messages, noted tone changes, patterns, contradictions. I didn't need proof for anyone else yet, but I needed it for myself, so I wouldn't second-guess what I was seeing. By that point, it was clear this wasn't about communication or connection. Every move she made was designed to reestablish leverage, to pull me back into a position where my stability depended on her approval. The more composed I remained, the more frantic her tactics became, and the clearer it was that what she wanted wasn't resolution, but control dressed up as concern. After a few days of watching the situation repeat itself in different costumes, I realized I needed outside perspective, not validation, but clarity. I started with my brother because he knows me well enough to tell when I'm rational and when I'm rationalizing. We met for coffee early one morning before work, and I laid everything out in order, from the ultimatum to the sudden affection, the public scenes, the involvement of other people. I didn't exaggerate or soften anything. I stuck to facts and patterns. He listened quietly, the way he always does when he's actually thinking instead of reacting. When I finished, he didn't hesitate or hedge. He told me what I was describing wasn't conflict, it was control, and that the reason it felt disorienting was because the rules kept changing depending on whether I complied. He pointed out that nothing I'd said involved mutual problem solving, only shifting expectations designed to keep me off balance. Not long after that, Emily's sister reached out to me privately. I hadn't initiated the conversation, but I didn't avoid it either. She approached it carefully, clearly trying not to betray family loyalty, but there was a tired honesty in the way she spoke. She admitted she'd seen similar patterns before, not just with me, but in Emily's previous relationships and even friendships. She talked about how Emily struggled whenever people around her hit milestones she hadn't reached yet, how engagement announcements and social media comparisons sent her into quiet spirals that usually ended with ultimatums or emotional tests. She didn't excuse the behavior, but she explained the insecurity behind it, the fear of being left behind, the need to feel chosen at all times. Hearing that didn't make me angry or vindicated, it made things clearer. The final step was speaking to a licensed relationship counselor on my own, not as a couple, but as an individual trying to understand what he was participating in. I walked them through the same timeline, the same behaviors, and the same internal reactions I'd been documenting. The counselor was precise with their language, careful not to diagnose or dramatize, but the conclusion was consistent with everything I'd already been told. An ultimatum framed as an evaluation without shared criteria wasn't healthy communication. It was a power move rooted in anxiety and comparison, not partnership. The sudden shifts between affection, guilt, and pressure weren't expressions of love, but attempts to regain emotional leverage once it slipped. What struck me most was when the counselor said that the most telling part of the situation wasn't Emily's behavior, but my response to it. The fact that my stability disrupted the dynamic meant the relationship relied on imbalance to function. That observation stayed with me long after the session ended. For the first time since all of this started, I felt grounded enough to turn the lens inward, not to judge myself, but to assess honestly. I began my own evaluation, quietly and without drama. I looked at how I felt waking up each day, how much mental energy the relationship required just to remain neutral, how often peace depended on my silence rather than mutual understanding. I compared that to how I felt in other areas of my life, where expectations were clear and respect was mutual. I didn't rush to conclusions or announce anything. I simply allowed myself to acknowledge the reality that had been forming all along. The question was no longer whether I could prove my worth to someone else, but whether this dynamic aligned with the life and partnership I was intentionally building. By the time I accepted that the relationship was likely ending, I had already stopped feeling reactive about it, which surprised me more than anything else. There was no dramatic switch, no final straw moment that sent me into action. It was quieter than that. I simply started preparing my life the same way I prepared for anything important, calmly, methodically, without emotion driving the process. I reviewed shared expenses, joint subscriptions, overlapping accounts, and long-term plans we talked about casually but never finalized. I didn't rush or hide what I was doing, but I didn't announce it either. I made sure everything was clean, fair, and easily explainable if it ever needed to be. I separated finances in a way that left no ambiguity. Anything that was mine stayed mine. Anything that was shared was documented and divided evenly. And anything that was hers was untouched. There was no urge to punish, withhold, or make things difficult. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to exit without damage. I updated passwords, transferred automatic payments, and canceled commitments that assumed a future I was no longer building. Each small task brought an unexpected sense of order, like putting away pieces of a life that had already served its purpose. Emotionally, the separation had already started before the logistics caught up. I noticed how little anxiety I felt compared to earlier weeks. Decisions that would have once sent me spiraling now felt straightforward. I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head or bracing for reactions. I wasn't checking my phone for shifts in her mood. The constant background noise I'd grown used had faded, and in its place was a steady quiet that made it easier to think clearly. Emily sensed the change before I ever acknowledged it out loud. Her behavior shifted again, but this time it lacked the confidence of control. She started talking about the future in definitive terms, using language she'd previously avoided. She made comments about choosing me, about realizing what she almost lost, about how the evaluation period had shown her what really mattered. The irony wasn't lost on me. The moment she tried to remove uncertainty by committing, the leverage she'd relied on was already gone. She became more attentive, more agreeable, quicker to compromise in ways she never had before. Plans were suddenly flexible. Criticism softened into praise. She tried to lock things in early, emotionally and socially, as if speed could reverse momentum. I didn't react strongly to any of it. I acknowledged her efforts without mirroring the urgency behind them. There was no satisfaction in watching the power dynamic flip, just confirmation that it had. What struck me most was how calm I felt while it was happening. Not numb, not detached, but centered. I wasn't afraid of the relationship ending anymore, and that changed everything. I realized that my peace no longer depended on her approval or her decisions. It depended on my alignment with myself. That understanding made every interaction lighter, every choice clearer. I continued untangling things quietly, leaving nothing unresolved, nothing that could be used later as a point of tension. There were no dramatic declarations or confrontations, just steady forward movement. For the first time since the ultimatum, I wasn't counting days or tracking shifts. I was simply living, grounded in the certainty that whatever came next would be chosen from a place of calm, not fear. We met on neutral ground, not the apartment, not anywhere layered with shared memories, just a quiet cafe neither of us had any emotional claim to. I arrived a few minutes early, ordered coffee, and sat where I could see the door. When Emily walked in, I could tell immediately she had rehearsed this moment as carefully as she had the ultimatum. Her eyes were red, her posture smaller, her confidence stripped down to something raw and uncertain. She sat across from me, hands shaking slightly as she wrapped them around her cup like it was an anchor. She didn't ease into it. The apology came fast and emotional, words tumbling over each other, telling me how wrong she'd been, how scared she was, how she let her insecurities get the best of her. She cried openly, not theatrically, but with real distress, talking about pressure, comparison, fear of being left behind, fear of not being chosen. She said the ultimatum was a mistake, that she never meant to hurt me, that she only wanted reassurance and didn't know how to ask for it in a healthy way. She told me she understood now, that she was ready to do things differently, that she wanted another chance to prove she could be better. I listened without interrupting her, the same way I had throughout the entire unraveling of our relationship. I didn't rush to comfort her or distance myself emotionally. I let her finish because she deserved to be heard, but I also knew that listening didn't mean agreeing. When she finally ran out of words, there was a long pause between us, heavy but calm. I didn't feel the urge to fill it. When I spoke, my voice was steady, not cold, not emotional, just clear. I told her that I believed her apology was sincere and that I didn't doubt her pain or her fear. I told her the problem was never a single bad decision or a poorly handled moment. The problem was the framework behind it. I explained that what broke things wasn't the ultimatum itself, but the belief that made it feel reasonable to her in the first place, the idea that love should be earned under pressure, that commitment should be tested, that someone's worth should be reviewed when insecurity shows up. I told her I wasn't interested in being in a relationship where stability depended on passing evaluations or surviving emotional stress tests. I said I didn't want to be with someone who needed leverage to feel safe, or who felt entitled to create fear in order to feel chosen. I explained that I had done my own evaluation during that week, not of her, but of the relationship itself, and that I didn't like who I would have to become to make it work long term. She tried to interrupt, to promise growth, therapy, change, anything necessary, but I calmly continued. I told her that people are allowed to learn, to grow, to make mistakes, but I wasn't willing to be someone's learning experience when the cost was my peace. I said that even if she never repeated the behavior, the belief behind it would always exist, and I didn't want to build a future on something that fragile. There was no anger in the moment, no raised voices, no dramatic exit, just a quiet understanding that the relationship had reached its end. When I finished, she cried again, softer this time, not fighting the outcome, but grieving it. I sat there with her for a few minutes longer, not as her partner, but as someone who still respected her humanity. Then I stood, paid for the coffee, and told her I wished her well. Walking out of that cafe, I didn't feel victorious or heartbroken. I felt resolved. The relationship didn't end in chaos or cruelty, but in clarity. For the first time since it all began, I wasn't reacting to someone else's terms. I was standing firmly in my own, And that made the ending final in a way no ultimatum ever could. The months after that conversation were quieter than anything I'd experienced in years. Not empty, but orderly. I moved into my own apartment within a few weeks, a place that was modest but intentional, chosen entirely for myself. Every box I unpacked felt symbolic, like I was putting pieces of my life back where they belonged instead of arranging them around someone else's comfort. The space reflected me, clean lines, early mornings, evenings that belonged to my own rhythm. There was no tension waiting for me when I opened the door, no emotional temperature to read before I could relax. That alone felt like progress. Work followed the same trajectory. The momentum from that business summit didn't fade, it compounded. Projects I'd poured energy into started paying off. Conversations turned into offers, and responsibilities expanded naturally instead of being dangled as incentives. When the promotion came through, it felt earned in the right way, not as validation, but as alignment. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I was building something stable, and the recognition followed without drama. The confidence I felt wasn't loud or performative. It was steady, rooted in consistency rather than reaction. Emotionally, the clarity surprised me the most. I realized how much mental space I'd been dedicating to managing someone else's insecurity, how much energy went into anticipating moods and adjusting myself to avoid conflict. Without that weight, my thoughts slowed down. Decisions felt simpler. I wasn't second-guessing my tone, my timing, my worth. I slept better. I trained better. Conversations with friends felt lighter because I wasn't carrying unresolved tension into every interaction. I didn't rush into anything new. I let myself exist without proving, without defending, without performing stability for anyone else. When memories of the relationship surfaced, they didn't trigger regret or anger, just understanding. I could see the pattern clearly now, how the ultimatum wasn't an isolated mistake, but a reflection of a dynamic that would have required me to shrink over time. That awareness didn't harden me. It sharpened me. Months later, without effort or expectation, I met someone new. There was no countdown, no evaluation period, no subtle power struggle disguised as concern. We spent time together because it felt good to do so, not because either of us was afraid of losing ground. Communication was direct. Boundaries were respected without being tested. There was no need to prove worth because it was assumed, mutual, unspoken. The absence of games was the most telling difference. Peace wasn't something we negotiated. It was the default. Looking back, the 7-day ultimatum was never really about me failing or succeeding. It was meant to create urgency, to destabilize me enough to regain control. Instead, it forced me to step back and see my life clearly. It exposed a dynamic I had slowly normalized and gave me the clarity to choose myself without guilt. What was intended as leverage became a turning point, not because I resisted loudly, but because I stayed grounded. I didn't reclaim my self-worth in a dramatic moment or a triumphant speech. I reclaimed it quietly, through consistency, boundaries, and the decision to walk away from something that required me to earn safety that week didn't end my life or derail my future. It redirected it, and the calm that followed wasn't accidental. It was the result of choosing a life where love wasn't conditional and stability wasn't something I had to pass a test to deserve.